believe in forgiving or forgetting?
He crashed my bike. My brand new, 2 weeks off the lot, cherry red Harley I'd spent nearly 6 months researching, financing, and dreaming about. And after he skidded it across 2 lanes of asphalt, dented the tank, crushed the forks, and scraped it down to the bone like some junkyard relic, he didn't even bother to say sorry. He didn't wince or cry or look ashamed. He just stood there, helmet off, sweat shining on his forehead, and smirked like a bratty teenager who just broke a lamp in your living room. "Chill," he said with a shrug, brushing gravel off his jeans like the blood on his palms didn't matter. "You'll forgive me. You always do." And right then, without saying a single word, I knew something in me had changed for good. I didn't scream. I didn't ask if he was okay. I didn't even look at the bike again, even though part of me could still hear the metallic crunch echoing in my chest. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, opened the insurance claim app, and forwarded him the draft I'd pre-filled last week, as a precaution, with his name already typed in, signature space forged so well it'd pass a microscope test. I hit send. He blinked at the notification. The grin slipped. And that was the moment I knew he had no idea what he'd actually started. The bike wasn't just a midlife crisis toy or some show-off purchase I got to feel cool again. I'm not that kind of woman. I'm not built for showy, dramatic gestures. That bike was my finish line. My new beginning. After my divorce from Ricky, after 15 years of a marriage where I felt more like a house manager than a partner, after the settlement that left me with more debt than dignity, I decided to stop waiting for anyone to save me. I'd spent over 4 decades being everyone's backup plan, everyone's emotional airbag, especially for my brother Danny, who seemed to believe that because he could smile like a movie star and talk his way out of parking tickets, the world owed him a free pass through every disaster he created. Danny's been like that since we were kids. He was the golden boy, reckless, charming, perpetually broke, perpetually forgiven. Our mom made excuses for him even when he got caught stealing cash from her purse back in high school. "Boys will be boys," she'd sigh, as if stealing was a phase like acne. When he crashed Dad's car at 19 while high off his ass, I was the one who drove him to court. When he got kicked out of community college after 2 semesters for inappropriate behavior, it was me who talked Dad into giving him one more chance. When he lied to his girlfriend about being laid off, but was actually fired for showing up drunk, I was the one who got him an interview at my friend's company. He ghosted that job in under 3 weeks. So no, the bike wasn't just about 2 wheels and a windblown escape. It was the first thing in over 20 years that was entirely, absolutely mine. No compromises. No sharing. No explanations. I financed it under my name, with the cleanest credit score I could scrape together after years of marital joint accounts and financial bleeding. I picked the model because it felt solid, fast, and a little dangerous. Not pretty. Not feminine. Just powerful. I'd taken the safety course, gotten my license, even signed up for a weekend riding group just to feel a part of something that didn't have wife, daughter, or big sister stamped on it. That bike was the thing that marked the start of me choosing me. So when Danny took it without asking, without even texting, and then had the gall to wreck it and act like I'd just lent him a sweater he accidentally stained, something snapped. But not in the way people expect. I didn't explode. I didn't even feel rage. I felt this slow, steady heat in my chest, like the start of a fever. Quiet. Focused. I was done being the cleanup crew. When I got home that night, after the scene at the crash site, after watching him half limp into my driveway with his scraped arm and busted ego, after his offhand "it'll buff out" comment, I didn't speak to him again. I didn't answer when Mom called me and said, "Don't be dramatic, honey." He didn't mean it. I didn't respond when Dad sent me a half-hearted text that said, "He's your brother. You know how he is." What I did do was open the file I'd been keeping for 6 months. I called it my disaster kit. Just in case. Inside was everything I'd prepped in case Danny ever pulled something like this. Because deep down, I always knew he would. Copies of emails, receipts, photos of the bike, a copy of the dealership contract, and most importantly, a blank insurance claim I'd started filling out after the first time he asked if he could maybe borrow it sometime, just to show someone. I told him no, of course. But his look told me he wasn't hearing me. He never really did. I'd practiced his signature once, not for fraud, but because he'd asked me to help with some forms last year, and I had to forge it to submit his tax refund when he ghosted on the process. He gave me verbal permission. That was my technical cover, even if it made me feel greasy. I'd saved the scanned copy. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of boxed red wine and the hum of the fridge the only sound in the house, I typed out the rest of the form. I didn't list myself as the claimant. I listed Danny. I marked unauthorized use and added just enough detail to make it look sloppy and honest. Then I signed his name at the bottom, using the digital stamp I'd saved months ago. And then I waited. Not for revenge. Not yet. But for that tiny shift in power, the one where he'd realize, for the first time in his life, that someone wasn't going to rescue him. The next morning, he texted me at 6:38. Hey, about the bike. Can we talk? I didn't reply. At 7:12, another one. Mom says you're pissed. Don't overreact, okay? Nothing. At 8:44, he called. I declined. At 9:15, I forwarded him the finalized claim. With the forged signature. With all the details. With the total damage estimate, $13,400. I watched the delivered notification pop up. 2 minutes later, the 3 little typing dots appeared. Then vanished. Then reappeared. He didn't send anything. And just like that, I knew he wasn't smiling anymore. But the best part? The insurance fraud was only the beginning. Because there was one thing he didn't know about that bike. One thing he never thought to ask about. And when the police found it, let's just say his little accident was going to become a whole lot more interesting. The thing with Danny, and maybe this is the part that gnawed at me more than the busted bike, the forged claim, or the way he looked at me like I was overreacting to something he didn't even bother to feel bad about, is that he never actually believed there'd be consequences, because in his mind, there never had been. Not once. Not when he totaled Dad's pickup and blamed it on faulty brakes, even though he'd been drinking at the lake with friends all afternoon. Not when he racked up $500 in speeding tickets on my old Corolla and tossed the envelopes in the trash, acting surprised when my license was suspended for non-payment. Not even when he sweet-talked his way into my apartment for just a week and ended up staying 4 months rent-free, inviting sketchy friends over, blowing through my groceries, and pawning my Bluetooth speakers for gas money. And every single time I confronted him, or even gently hinted that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't okay to keep doing this, he'd lean into that same tired expression, that wounded, baffled look that said, "I thought you loved me. Why are you making such a big deal out of nothing?" But this wasn't nothing. When I found out about the signature, not just the fact that he'd forged it this time, but that he'd already used it, submitted it, committed the kind of insurance fraud that people actually go to jail for, something cold and sharp settled into my chest. It wasn't rage or betrayal or even sadness anymore. It was a kind of clinical clarity, the kind you get when you stop trying to save a drowning man who keeps pulling you under with him. It started with a call to the insurance agent. Her name was Karen, mid-50s, straight shooter, the kind of woman who didn't sugarcoat. I'd met her once, back when I bought the policy, and I remembered she'd looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're gonna want to lock that garage. Sport bikes get stolen by the minute, and most thefts start with someone you know." At the time I'd laughed, not because she was wrong, but because I hadn't thought I had anyone like that in my life. Turns out I did. I had a brother. I called her the morning after Danny's little crash and grin performance. I didn't accuse anyone of anything, not directly. I just asked a few careful questions, pretended I was updating the file, verifying documents, confirming that everything was up to date. That's when she said it, casually, almost in passing. "Yeah, we got the signed authorization form last month. That's why the claim was pre-approved. His signature's on file." She said his. Not mine. I didn't speak for a few seconds. Just let the words settle in my ear like wet concrete. He hadn't just taken the bike. He hadn't just wrecked it and expected me to eat the cost. He'd already started laying the groundwork for the cover-up weeks ago. He'd forged my name, submitted the form, and sent it to the insurance company like it was nothing. Just like the way he used to fake doctor's notes in high school to get out of gym class. Just like the way he used to sign Dad's name on those report cards we never saw. He probably thought I'd never find out. Or worse, that I'd find out and, like always, let it go. Because I always did. I always folded. I always told myself he didn't mean it, that he was just in a bad place, that maybe this would be the last time. But something about this, maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the fact that the bike was mine in a way nothing else ever had been, maybe it was that smile on his face when he told me to chill, like my boundaries were some kind of joke. Flipped a switch in me that I didn't even know existed. I hung up with Karen, walked into my home office, and opened the drawer where I kept all the family tax records, years of Danny's scribbled W-2s, his ignored letters from the IRS, his pathetic half-filled applications for jobs he never followed up on. Buried in the back was a folder labeled Danny, Tax Returns 2019. Inside was a scanned PDF I'd saved during the time I filed for him, the one where he gave me verbal consent to just take care of it because he was too busy. That was the first time I forged his signature, and I remembered how easy it was, how natural it felt to do the thing he couldn't be bothered to do for himself. Back then, I thought I was helping. Now I realized I'd been training myself, or worse, training him, to believe that my help was infinite. I opened the PDF, dragged his signature into a new file, and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't even a good signature. Just a loop and a squiggle, no legibility, no style. Just the same laziness he brought to everything. But it was enough. Enough to sink him if I wanted to. Later that night, Dad called. His voice was soft, uncertain, like he knew he was walking into a storm, but didn't want to admit it. He told us what happened, he said. The bike. The insurance thing. He says it's all just a misunderstanding. I didn't answer. I waited. He's scared, Lori. Says you're out for blood. I laughed, and it wasn't a warm laugh. It was cold, flat, hollow. He should be, I said, and hung up. Mom texted an hour later. Please don't ruin his life over a mistake. As if forging someone's name and filing a false claim was a misplaced decimal or a wrong delivery pizza. And maybe that's the problem. To them, it was always just a mistake. A little bump. A phase. To me, it was one more shard in the pile of glass I'd been crawling over for years. The next morning, I called a friend of mine, not a close friend, more of a long-ago acquaintance I'd helped with some bookkeeping mess when her ex-husband tried to hide assets during their divorce. Turned out she'd gone into law enforcement and was now working with white-collar crime in the city's fraud division. I told her a hypothetical. A soft scenario. Let's say someone files a claim under someone else's name, with a forged signature. What happens? She was quiet for a moment, then said, depends who finds out first, the company or the cops. But either way, it's a felony. Minimum 2 years. More if there's any history. I thanked her. Hung up. I didn't file the report that day. I didn't even threaten Danny. I just sat with the knowledge that, for the first time, I had the power. And unlike him, I knew exactly what to do with it. But what he didn't know, not yet, anyway, was that the signature wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what happened during the ride. What the bike saw. What the camera caught. What I hadn't told anyone about, not yet. And when that came out, no forged form in the world would save him. People like Danny never pay attention to the fine print, to the little details that matter, to the things that aren't loud or flashy or begging for attention, and that's exactly why they always get caught, not in a spectacular explosion of drama or scandal, but in the quiet, patient unraveling of the truth that's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The thing about my brother is, for all his swagger and bravado, for all the years he managed to skate by on charm and improvisation, he never really understood how the world works when it stops handing you grace for free. He lived like a man who thought consequences were optional, like life was a buffet where someone else always picked up the tab. And that's why he didn't know about the tracker. It wasn't some elaborate spy gadget or high-tech secret buried in the guts of the machine. It was a simple GPS unit, a basic requirement from the business insurance policy I had taken out the same week I bought the bike. What Danny didn't know couldn't have known, because he never once asked me what the bike meant to me or why I had purchased it in the first place, was that it wasn't just a toy or a vanity purchase. It was a business investment, a pivot point in my life, the first step toward a small motorcycle touring venture I had quietly begun to build behind the scenes, piecing it together after hours on weekends, and in the quiet hours between bill payments and freelance accounting gigs. The idea was modest but solid: weekend scenic tours for beginners, one-on-one ride training for women who'd always wanted to ride but never had the nerve, and eventually even custom weekend getaways. That bike was the pilot project, the first piece of equipment, the asset around which the entire plan revolved, and part of getting it insured as a business tool meant installing a dash cam and a GPS unit that logged every route, every stop, every ignition. I hadn't thought much of it after the initial setup. It was there, it worked, and that was enough. Until Danny got on the bike. When I pulled up the GPS data 2 days after the crash, I wasn't looking for revenge, not really. I was looking for confirmation, a breadcrumb trail that would show me exactly how far he'd taken it, both literally and figuratively. What I found was worse than I expected. The route alone was absurd. He hadn't just taken a joyride around the block or up the county roads like he'd claimed. He'd driven it over 70 miles out of town, stopping at 2 bars along the way, one of them known locally for its wild Saturday nights and lax ID enforcement. The timestamps were damning. The bike was parked for almost 3 hours at the second location, long enough for more than just a few drinks. But it was the dashcam footage that turned everything inside out. I sat alone in my office, late at night, shades drawn, room dark except for the bluish glow of the monitor, as the video loaded silent, high-definition, wide-angle footage from the front and rear cams. At first, it was just wind and motion, the steady hum of the road, nothing out of place. Then I saw Danny. He looked cocky, reckless, like a man trying to prove something to a woman, which made sense, because there was a woman behind him. She wasn't wearing proper gear, just a crop top, shorts, and a helmet that looked 2 sizes too big. She clung to him loosely, unsteady, like she wasn't used to being on a bike, or maybe just not sober enough to be aware of how fast they were going. The footage from the second stop was worse. You could see him stumbling slightly as he helped her off the bike. She laughed too loudly. He lit a cigarette, cracked open a beer, and leaned against the bike like it was a prop in some low-budget action movie. The angle caught the beer clearly, unmistakably. He drank it fast, then another. The timestamp rolled forward. The woman started to argue with him about something, her voice muffled in the background, but her hands were expressive, agitated. She tried to leave once, but he pulled her arm back, laughing like it was a joke. Eventually, they got back on the bike. The moment the engine started again, I felt a kind of dread fill my chest. I knew what was coming, and I couldn't stop it. The footage showed him speeding. No helmets on either of them this time. They swerved twice, once narrowly missing a pickup. Then the camera jerked, violently, and the screen filled with gravel and sky as the bike hit the ground, hard. He never told me she'd been on it. Not once. He made it sound like a solo ride gone wrong, like maybe he misjudged a curve or hit a patch of oil. But watching the footage made it clear, he wasn't just careless. He was dangerous. And he had no idea that every moment, every single dumb choice, had been recorded in crisp detail. No editing. No room for denial. I downloaded the footage and saved 3 separate copies. One on my computer, one in a cloud folder with a password only I knew, and one on a thumb drive I kept in my purse, just in case. Then I printed out the route logs and damage assessments and tucked them into a manila envelope. I wasn't planning to take it to the police yet, not then. I was still processing. Still trying to decide just how far I was willing to go. Because part of me still clung to the idea that he was my brother, that blood meant something, that maybe, just maybe, this could be the wake-up call he needed. But the other part of me, the colder, clearer part, saw the girl on the back of that bike and thought, what if she'd died? What if he'd killed her? and then walked away like he always did, with a smirk and a shrug, expecting me to clean it up, to bury it, to pretend it never happened. And that's when I knew this wasn't about the bike anymore. This was about the pattern, the lifelong, bleeding, escalating pattern of Danny doing whatever the hell he wanted and assuming the world would mop up the mess behind him. I didn't need to destroy him. All I had to do was stop saving him. And let the truth do the rest. There's a moment, and I think most people who've ever held back their truth for too long will know it, when you realize that silence doesn't make you strong, and forgiveness isn't a virtue if it comes at the cost of your own dignity. When all the years you spent smoothing things over, making excuses, biting your tongue, and telling yourself that people will change if you just love them hard enough, crash into a wall built out of the simple, undeniable truth that some people will only ever learn when they're finally forced to. And for me, that moment arrived one muggy Thursday morning, just past 9, when Officer Megan Torres walked up the narrow path to my parents' front porch, not with sirens or handcuffs or any kind of dramatic flair, but with a file folder in one hand and a calm, measured determination in her eyes that told me she was here to deliver more than just a routine follow-up. It hadn't been easy getting her there, and it hadn't been my first option either. After all, for years I'd kept everything that Danny did inside the family. We didn't talk about it publicly, not really. We just handled it, quietly, behind closed doors. That was our dynamic. I cleaned up, he moved on, our parents looked the other way, and no one ever spoke plainly. But after I'd watched the footage, after I saw that girl's frightened face and the wobble in Danny's hands when he restarted the bike, I knew I couldn't carry this one. Not morally, not legally, and not emotionally. So I made a discreet call, not to press charges, not yet, but to inform and to protect. To ask the right questions. To open a door. Megan wasn't just some beat cop. She was someone I'd once worked with, years ago, on a forensic audit for a fraud case that had gutted a small nonprofit. We'd only met twice in person, but I remembered her eyes, the way she listened without interruption, without judgment, and then asked the one question no one else had thought to ask. So I trusted her to walk into the chaos that was my family and not get swept up in the emotional quicksand of blame and denial. When she knocked, I stayed seated on the edge of the porch swing, back straight, coffee cooling untouched in my hand. I watched as my mother opened the door, her smile automatic and practiced, the same one she used for Jehovah's Witnesses and mailmen. Megan introduced herself and asked if Danny was home. I could already hear the defensiveness rising in Mom's voice before she even turned her head toward me. "Lori," she said sharply, like I'd broken some sacred rule. "What is this? Why is there a police officer here asking about your brother?" Danny appeared a second later, shirtless, barefoot, with that same infuriating half-smile, the one he'd been flashing since the day he learned he could talk his way out of trouble with a joke and a compliment. "Hey," he said, eyes flicking between me and Megan, tone light, breezy, pretending like this was some kind of casual misunderstanding. "What's going on?" Megan was calm. She handed him the file. "We're looking into a few irregularities regarding a vehicle insurance claim filed last week," she said, her voice even. "There are some questions that need answering, and you're listed as the operator in one of the associated documents." I watched the blood drain from his face, watched the confusion flicker into something closer to fear, watched him open the file and see his own forged signature staring back at him, above the words claimant and damaged in collision. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like he was about to say something clever, but nothing came out. Then came the pivot. Always the pivot. Danny's greatest talent wasn't lying, it was making you feel guilty for not believing him. "Lori," he said, turning to me, voice full of hurt and disbelief, "you called the cops on me? Are you serious? Over a bike?" Mom gasped like he'd been shot, clutching the doorframe. "Oh my God, Lori, how could you do this to your own brother?" And in that moment, with every part of my past begging me to back down, to soften, to sweep it all away again like I always had, I did something I had never done before. I said absolutely nothing. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't plead for them to understand. I let the silence do what my words never could. I let them sit with the reality that the person they had always assumed would bend had finally, irrevocably, stopped bending. Megan continued unfazed. "We also have footage," she said, and now Danny looked like he'd swallowed a brick. "There may be additional legal concerns, including possible DUI and reckless endangerment, but that will depend on what we verify in the next few days. Right now, we're just gathering information." He stammered something about mistakes, about confusion, about how the girl on the bike, her name was Sarah, apparently had told him she was fine, that it wasn't a big deal, that she didn't want to press charges. He looked at Megan like he expected that to end the conversation, like her nodding would signal that this little hiccup was about to be swept back under the rug. But Megan didn't nod. She just closed the file, tucked it under her arm, and said, "We'll be in touch." And then she turned to me and added, gently, "Thank you for cooperating." That night, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it, and not in a peaceful way, but in the way that happens when everything polite and pleasant has been burned away, leaving only smoke and questions. I sat at the kitchen table, eating leftovers alone while my mother cried in the living room, and my father retreated into the garage, as if escaping into the smell of old tools and motor oil could protect him from what was happening inside his own home. No one spoke to me directly, but I could feel the weight of their silence, not the silence of guilt or regret, but the silence of betrayal, the kind that comes not from the wrongdoing itself, but from the audacity of finally refusing to pretend it didn't matter. Around midnight, Danny cornered me by the laundry room. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way a person looks when their image of themselves has cracked and they haven't figured out what to do with the pieces. "You want to ruin my life over a damn bike," he hissed, low and bitter, like I'd done something unspeakable. What kind of person does that to their own blood? And I looked him in the eye, really looked at him, for the first time in years, and said, with a calmness I didn't even know I possessed, "It's not about the bike, Danny. It's about what you keep doing and expecting everyone else to pay for." He didn't answer. Just stood there, breathing hard, eyes burning with the kind of anger that comes from entitlement being challenged for the first time. I walked away. Because nothing I said could ever compete with what was coming next. He still didn't know that Sarah had talked. He didn't know what she'd told Officer Torres. He didn't know that the next time someone knocked on that front door, it might not be a conversation. It might be handcuffs. The thing about revenge, the kind that brews slow and quiet like a storm you see forming on the edge of the horizon, but convince yourself will pass, is that it doesn't always come in the form of thunder or spectacle or some grand, satisfying eruption sometimes. It's just the absence of interference, the refusal to extend a hand when the person tumbling into their own destruction reaches out, once again, expecting to be caught. I didn't want to destroy Danny. I didn't want to watch him burn. I didn't need him in cuffs or on the news or sobbing in court to feel like I'd won. What I needed, what I had never been granted in over 4 decades of sacrificing my time, my energy, my savings, my peace, was distance. Clarity. And the kind of resolution that only comes when you let someone fall without cushioning the blow. After the visit from Officer Torres, things shifted in the house, not in any loud, immediate way, but like a foundation starting to crack beneath its own weight. The silences grew longer, the glances colder. The tension so thick you could practically taste it in the air during dinner, where Mom kept stabbing at her plate without eating and Dad pretended to be fascinated by his phone like a man who'd never used a screen in his life. Danny stopped posturing. The swagger drained from his shoulders. The door to his room stayed closed for hours at a time, and when I passed by, I heard the dull, desperate clatter of him on the phone, talking in hushed tones to people who, I imagine, were less patient than I had been, bosses, maybe. Or friends whose loyalty had a shorter expiration date than mine. What he didn't know, and what I never told him, was that I hadn't filed the formal charges. Not entirely. What I'd done was far more surgical, far more effective, and far more terrifying for someone like him. I'd filed the preliminary paperwork, just enough to get the wheels turning, just enough to alert the system, to open a case number, to make it real. I'd submitted the footage to Officer Torres and included a sworn statement, but I hadn't signed the last authorization page. That final act, The one that would have turned everything from investigation to prosecution, remained in my drawer and signed, untouched, waiting. Not because I wanted to spare him, but because I wanted him to feel what it was like to live with a consequence he couldn't predict or manipulate or sweet-talk away. He started asking questions, subtle at first. "So, what did she say?" he asked our mother one afternoon, trying to sound casual, as if he were talking about a neighbor or a stranger. "Did Sarah say anything about that night?" I don't know what Mom told him, or whether she had the capacity to understand what was really happening anymore, but I know she looked tired. Like someone who'd spent her entire life defending a version of her son that never really existed and was only just beginning to realize it. Dad stayed out of it entirely. I think, in his own passive way, he knew he'd failed both of us and didn't know how to fix it. Sarah, the girl from the footage, had come forward 2 days after the officer's visit. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't press charges or demand restitution. She just gave a statement. She described Danny as drunk, erratic, and aggressive. She admitted she hadn't been in any shape to consent to the ride, and that when she asked him to slow down, he laughed and told her she was killing the vibe. It wasn't just about the crash, not really. It was about the choice to ignore fear, to treat another person like a prop in a show he was performing for no one but himself. Her statement wasn't accusatory. It was quiet, devastating, true. And it was enough. Word travels fast in small cities, especially among circles where reputations are built on charm and confidence rather than substance. Danny lost a job offer before it even began, something with a startup he'd been bragging about for weeks. The recruiter called him, vaguely referenced legal issues and optics, and then ghosted him completely. His social media accounts went quiet, his friends stopped dropping by, and his last girlfriend, a woman he'd only just started seeing, stopped returning his texts after someone, probably Sarah, sent her a link to the footage. For the first time in his adult life, Danny had no backup plan, no fallback, no one willing to hold the net. That's when I left him the letter. It wasn't long. Just a few pages, handwritten, folded neatly and placed inside the glove box of the old Civic he still drove like it was a Ferrari, even though it rattled above 60 and smelled like stale cologne and fast food. I didn't tell him I'd written it. I didn't sign it. But I knew he'd know it was me. Inside, I listed everything, not just the incident, not just the forgery or the crash, but all of it. The entire goddamn history of our relationship, laid out like an audit. Every loan I never got back. Every time I bailed him out of trouble. Every lie I had to tell to protect him. Every sacrifice that was never acknowledged. I didn't accuse him. I didn't curse him. I simply documented him. Like a report. Like evidence. And then I ended with a single sentence. "I'm done being your accomplice." When he found it, and I know he did, because 3 days later he packed up what little he had and left without a word, not even a final jab or a goodbye, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. Hollow. But also free. I sold what was left of the bike for scrap. Used the money to finally register the LLC I'd been planning for months. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. A beginning that didn't require permission or forgiveness or someone else's disaster hanging like an anvil around my neck. The house was quieter without him, and while the silence carried a sadness, the kind you feel when you accept that someone you loved will never become the person you imagined, it also carried peace. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, I got a call from Officer Torres. Nothing urgent, she said, but something had come up. She mentioned that Sarah had followed up her statement with a new one, more detailed, more serious, involving a separate incident from the same night. She didn't give me specifics, but her voice told me everything I needed to know. The wheels were turning now on their own. This wasn't about me anymore. I never saw the signed authorization again. I never had to turn it in. Because the truth has a way of catching up to people like Danny, even when everyone else steps aside. He thought it was about the bike. He thought it was about the money. He thought it was just another mess for me to fix. But it was never about any of that. It was about what happens when you finally, truly stop cleaning up. and let someone see what the world looks like without a safety net. And the worst part, the part that still lingers, late at night, like the echo of a door slamming one room too far away, is that even now, after everything, I don't know if I did the right thing. I only know that I did something. And sometimes, that's all a person has left.